Welcome to the Intentions podcast. Today I have the honor to sit down with my dear friend, Keren. Hi, Keren.
Hi.
Welcome to the show.
I'm so honored to be here. I feel like the greats have come before me, so.
I love this because I just get to interview people that I really respect and learn from them and talk to them. And so it's like coffee dates with some headphones. So
yeah.
Could you introduce yourself to those who might not be familiar with the Queen?
Yes. My name is Keren. I was born and lived half of my life in Congo. And then I moved here to the States when I was about 12. And I've pretty much been here ever since with a few excursions. But mostly been here. I love Jesus, and I'm really thankful to have known him like most of my life, pretty much my whole life. But I think especially when I talk about like walking with the Lord, I'm really thankful to have done that for as long as I can remember. So yeah.
That's what I pray for my son.
Yeah, honestly, man, like no more no more trauma. No, please.
Come on. I love that. Yeah, when you introduce yourself, like that's the core of it. That's beautiful. And it's kind of cool that you started out by like, okay, I was born in Congo and then I moved to the US, and it's really fun because we're going to get into a huge conversation today about worldview and culture and gospel, and no one better than to have it with than Keren.
I don't know about that. I feel like there's definitely some people out there, but yeah, it's been a huge part of my life, and so I'm really excited to yap about it.
And you have a huge affection for Korea.
I do. I really do. If you open my kitchen, you'll definitely see that.
Listen, you can tell a lot about a person's worldview by the food they take.
I agree with that. I think that's a really, really good take, because my family's honestly like kind of like that. Our kitchen is like a whole world.
My mama too. She can cook anything. I'm working on it, but
I mean, I think it also is a thing of like if you like to cook too.
That's true.
Yeah, because it is a lot harder to cook other foods than it is to like, because with American food, all the ingredients are here. With Korean, Congolese food, you kind of have to go on a bit of a hunt.
I'm grateful for Lexington though, because you get all the markets from different continents, as well as for the most part. I mean, we don't have everything, but if you want something.
Yeah, I think my mom has said that some things like are easier to find here than they were for her in Philadelphia, which is kind of shocking, but
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, Lexington. All right.
Yeah, little Lexington is doing pretty well.
Not bad. But I also appreciate that it's not a huge city too. So to get the cuisines of the world without the traffic of the world is nice.
You really start to appreciate that whenever you're commuting every day.
That's true.
Yeah, when I had to do that, I was like, this is bad, but it very much could be worse.
You're going to be an optimist about this. Yeah. Okay. So you and I have had countless coffees about, everything under the sun, but most of them land smack dab in the middle between Jesus and culture. And we've had a lot of conversations about the 3 dominant moral worldviews. But before we get into those, could you kind of unpack what a worldview is?
Yeah. A worldview, I think it's kind of a very basic way to summarize how a culture operates within its context. So, for example, one of the worldviews that we'll probably be talking about today is like honor shame. So basically that's just kind of saying that like within this culture, the overarching theme of how people interact with one another kind of circles around that. Like relationships are not like, it's not 100%, but I think it's like a good estimate of like what's going on within the culture, kind of trying to explain how people relate to one another, how they kind of operate within the context of the culture that they're in. What are the rules within the culture?
Mhm.
What happens when you don't operate within those rules? What happens when you do? So kind of, hopefully that was a good
That's so good.
explanation.
And it's a little bit of a nebulous thing to try and describe or articulate, because I've often heard the metaphor for this is it's the water you swim in. And
Oh, that's good.
yeah, you don't really notice the water that you're swimming in. Let's say
Yeah.
it's like salt water, for example, until you go into a seawater and you're like, ooh, this is
Yeah, this
different. I
feels
don't know the
weird.
rules. Like,
Yeah.
and so, um, yeah, it's the way we see the world. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, you touched on honor, shame. And yeah, that's one of the three. And the other two would be fear and power, and then guilt and innocence. And so each of these worldview, moral frameworks that we've named is a little bit of a dichotomy. And so it shows, I guess, maybe some of the more positive values and the negative values within a culture. So
Yeah.
we were talking before we started recording about the West, for example, historically and currently probably being largely a guilt innocence framework. And so that explains, or you could also say like right and wrong. So we really value justice and specificity and innocent until proven guilty, those type of things. And so,
Yeah, very much kind of written within the justice system, like the words used. I think that's maybe a good way to kind of figure out if you're wondering like what context are you in and what context you live in, like kind of figure out what
mhm,
kind of words or like hot topics within your culture. Um, yeah.
that's really insightful. Yeah. So, for the other two, are there like main areas or places that align with fear, power, honor, shame?
Yeah, I think from what I've seen personally, and even just a class that I took over at the university, typically a lot of like African countries, I would say, operate within the like the fear power,
Hmm.
and that has a whole lot to do. I think when you even look at like the spiritual context,
Hmm.
and I think there's also definitely nuance there. I think there's also some like honor shame
Hmm.
just because of how like communalistic a lot of the cultures are. But I would say primarily like fear power.
Yeah.
And then,
Oh, sorry.
okay.
I think that's a really important distinction because, in my opinion, no culture is 100% one of the three, but maybe I imagine it as like a pie chart with what percentage
I
of.
completely agree.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Bet. What percentage? And would you say that cultures that have some degree of animism or like feeling like they need to curry favor with or appease like spiritual beings align with fear power, or would you see it differently?
I think so. I think that's definitely where some of that comes into play. Because growing up in Congo, I think a lot of the fear power that I witnessed came very much from this kind of like spiritual survival. For example, like I grew up in the midst of people who were very, very like devoted Christians. I very much saw that in my family, but I think there was also people who were like the majority of people would probably say they're Christians, but I think there's definitely also quite a big um, percentage of that who still dabble in some other spiritual powers.
Mm,
And if I had to ask them, I think a lot of it just kind of comes from this fear of like trying to survive. Because I witnessed that. Like I witnessed so many moments where it was just kind of like fight or flight. It's like, oh my goodness, like you can't go to sleep at night. You're having all of these strange dreams where it's like the oppression feels so real. And
mm,
it's almost like, oh, like I might die. And I've seen people die from stuff like this. And so it's almost like this fear of what's out there, but then also like the positive parts of it is like there's power,
mm,
especially like obviously like in the name of Jesus, like there's power, and you get to see that at work. You also get to see the other powers at work, which is kind of freaky. But I think that definitely plays into the part of like fear power. I think there's also some cultural aspects to it that aren't necessarily as spiritual, of just kind of like operating within a communalistic culture. It's like, oh, if I don't do this, like what happens? That
Hmm.
fear of like not, I think in Congo, maybe not being the norm is not necessarily the biggest fear, but just more of like alienation. Because it is kind of one of those societies where it operates so well on community. Like, it took a village to raise me.
Hmm.
And whenever you alienate your family, like, what do? You don't have that village to raise everybody, your kids. You don't have people to bring you food when you're in trouble, kind of thing. So I think maybe that's a small part of it as well.
Mm. What you said makes me really curious. So, how would you differentiate between fear power and honor shame? In both, there's a need to conform to the group identity, otherwise, there will be costliness.
Mhm.
How would you differentiate in those different contexts, like what that looks like?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because I think um, because of the context of like this communal um, worldview, there's a lot of overlap. But I
Mm-hmm.
think one distinction that I can think of right now is even just like in the wording.
Hmm.
For example, in like fear power, the positive result might be looked at like victory. Like we are victorious in this.
Mm.
Like like we have succeeded in like doing this. And
Huh.
whether it's just kind of like, for example, with my family, like whether it's just kind of like we've succeeded in like bringing peace or something, or even the opposite of that, like with fear, I think it's just kind of like this anxiousness of like what's to come,
Mm.
what happens if, whereas I think in like honor shame, it's kind of like uplifting, I think, is like the
Hmm.
positive result. It's kind of like if you are honored within those cultures, you're kind of looked at from a different perspective.
Mm.
I'm trying to figure out how to explain this.
No, it makes sense because if, I don't know, it sounds like in maybe Congo or other like maybe African cultures or other places where it's predominantly fear power, it sounds like you're in the state of fight or flight, like an extreme intensity
Yeah.
that is both spiritual and physical to some extent. And
Yeah.
maybe the overlap is much more intense than an honor shame context, or certainly like a right and wrong context, because theoretically we know spiritual warfare is real here, but maybe it looks vastly different than in Congo.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes sense that if you feel like you're at war, the result of that would feel like victory.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if the context is different in honor shame,
Yeah.
it would look like being honored. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even like in honor shame, it's like I think something that we sometimes see a lot is whenever there is a conflict, the tension is more of like, do I conform or do I not? Or even just whenever you do something wrong, sometimes there's this immediate reaction of like wanting to just alienate yourself. And I think maybe there's like a few examples of that in places like Japan or Korea. Like if somebody doesn't get a really good job or something like that, like they may start to alienate themselves from like their family and their loved ones and their friends, and kind of become a bit of like a recluse. Whereas I think in context of like fear and power, that tension is just more of like a survival tension. Like something that I remember when I lived in Congo is kind of like always being anxious in a way. Like I always dreaded whenever we would have like family meetings, because I always dreaded hearing the sentence of like, hey, we're in a really rough spiritual warfare right now. Like it's time to buckle up. Because I think I just hated this whole thing of like, it seems like I'm never resting. Like I'm always fighting something. And so I feel like that anxiousness is kind of like the tension that you're in, whereas maybe an honor shame is just, it's still a form of anxiety, but I think it's more of like, do I conform or do I not? Like, how can I conform, or like, how do I stand out without standing out too much?
Right. That's really well put. Like you were saying, some of the cultural idioms, like expressions, that sort of thing, both presently, and all of these have historical roots as well. So when you can understand something through the context of a moral worldview, it takes something like seppuku, or like killing yourself out of honor. It starts to make a lot more sense. Whereas if you look at that from like a Western context, it's like, that's kind of crazy. But when you understand, like in honor shame societies, you're doing things to not only as a reflection of yourself and your hard work, but to bring honor to a community, to get a good job, to better your country. You know, it would be better to, this is the way that people think, right? It would be better to die than to bring shame. And so, yeah.
And I think even, not to look at TV as a complete representation of what's going on, but I think in a lot of ways it is sometimes a representation of that. But like, even though in Congo sometimes there's this like need to do well for your family, I think I see that a lot more in context of like honor shame, because it's like your family is kind of like your representation of your family. I think that weight is a lot heavier in those circumstances. Whereas, for example, in Congo, with it being what I would say predominantly fear of power, I didn't feel that much pressure to like act a certain way. And obviously, you know, like African countries, you know, they're like, yeah, be an engineer, a doctor, or whatever. But even in that, I think there's a lot more grace that I've seen than maybe in like honor shame, or maybe it's not even about like whether or not there's grace. It's more of whether or not we think there will be grace.
Interesting. It's like the anticipation.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's like the expectations and what we see kind of is more dreadful than what may actually happen. But yeah, I think there's definitely some of it in Congo, because I think I would say that like after fear power, the other one that would be more predominant would be honor shame. So there's definitely a lot of overlap in that. But I think overall, it's a lot less of an expectation.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'd kind of like to take a stab at how anxiety presents itself in all of these different contexts, because I mean, anxiety has been on the rise in the West for quite a long time, and it makes sense, right? When you look out at the world and how horrible things are, and news media, which survives based on fear mongering and these like short clips and, you know, things like that. And I think there's even, I mean, I wrestle with this a little bit of, well, let me back up for a second. The reality is like, we're all at war to some extent, like spiritual warfare, whether we're cognizant of it or not is a reality. But I mean, our enemy is intelligent and presents, he contextualizes well, you know? And so I think for a largely Western context, I mean, for me, it can often look like agonizing over what is right, what is wrong. And like in a lot of these things that I agonize over, either option would be fine, but it's almost this like analysis paralysis of, which is very different than what you were talking about as like a little girl growing up in like the weighty, oppressive.
Yeah. And I think there's probably been a difference, because I haven't been back home in, like 12 years. And so I think there's probably been a change. And I probably should preface that this is not probably a universal experience. But I think in that anxiousness that I experience, and even now, like now that I can compare what those two experiences are, I think it's definitely like you put it like here, for example, when I'm in the States, I think it's a lot of what you said of like, am I like, what's wrong? What's right? It's like agonizing over this kind of like morality argument in my mind, and trying to like position myself in what's right, not just like in the eyes of the world, but also like in the eyes of God as well. But I think in Congo, like even just kind of thinking about it, I still remember some of like that anxious feeling of like, oh my goodness, like what's going to happen tomorrow? Like, I grew up having some very extreme dreams. And so I think that definitely didn't help. And operating in that like like intense spiritual context, I think it just kind of like naturally brings up that anxiety and like, how do I survive this? Because it's like it's right there in front of you, like you can't escape it. And I know my friends have had different experiences in different contexts, but I think in my specific context, it felt normal, but I think at the same time, like the weight that it had on my mental health, I don't think I even really acknowledged it until like maybe a few years ago when I started to think about, why did I have like so much, like it would be like, oh, I miss home, but I think a part of me also is like, but I'm also scared to go home because like the tension there, it's so heavy in a different way. And I love what you said earlier about like how the devil like contextualizes how he approaches people, because I think sometimes like here in the West, like we forget that like spiritual powers are a thing. But I think it's just him being smart and contextualizing through ways that affects us a bit more in the context that we're in. Whereas in Congo, it's like witchcraft is very real, like spirits are very real. I think most people don't have a problem with like whether or not there is like powers out there because they've witnessed it.
Right.
It's just more of like which one is strong, which one is stronger, because that's where I want my stake in, you know. And so I think that's like, because of that, like we kind of operate in this context of like survival mode, and not necessarily survival mode in like fighting physically, but just more of like what can I do to survive in this climate. And it's so interesting because it's like I see that, but then I think there's also like a difference there of like whenever I think about how we operate as a community, because I don't think there is greed. There's definitely greed, and there is definitely this aspect of like, I will do whatever it takes to survive. But I think in some ways there's also a lot of compassion and empathy of like, you help your neighbor though. Like, so it's interesting that like all of these things coexist in that context. And there's a lot of ways that I've seen compassion in Congo that I haven't seen here.
Do you think that is due to a cultural value of benevolence? Like if someone has more means, that it is the moral expectation to help those less fortunate, or something different?
Good question. I think I've seen that in my family. Yeah. I think there's definitely sometimes this expectation of like, whenever you have more, you give more. And I don't know if that's always driven by a biblical view of things.
Fair enough.
I think sometimes it's just more of like the selfish of like, I have less than you, so you give more to me because you have more. But I think I've also seen it being driven by biblical context as well.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how would you break down fear in an honor shame context? Because I mean, my 2 cents about it would be the predominant fear would be a lack of belonging if you don't measure up to the accomplishment. But I mean, how would you see it?
I think I would agree with that. Yeah. I think, yeah. And I think not maybe even to emphasize a bit more on that of like lack of belonging and how that impacts everybody that you love.
Hmm.
And I think from what I've read a little bit, and I think that's some of the reasons as to why suicide sometimes is a bit higher in honor shame contexts, because it's like, you mentioned this earlier, I think, of like, it's better if I just go rather than bring shame on myself, bring shame on my family, because if I just go, then that's just that, you know. um and so I think that that fear of like alienation and how it impacts your loved ones has to be so much greater than the want to live, which is, I think, kind of stark to me, because even though I have operated in some honor shame context, it hasn't been to that degree.
Same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why does all of this talk about moral worldviews even matter?
Great question. I mean, this is an easy answer, but I think it's because it matters to God. I think contextualization is all throughout the Bible, like starting from the very beginning, the way in which God approaches Abraham, the way in, I guess, Abram at that time, but the way in which like he puts himself in a context that the people he's talking to can understand. And I don't think that minimizes God in any ways. I think it's just kind of like, sometimes I'm a bit of a visual person, so I kind of like to see it as like, if God is like this infinite ball that it's like multifaceted, and that like we can't fathom all of these like sides to him. I think sometimes him contextualizing himself is kind of pointing the side to which we understand best. Like, like for example, in like fear power culture, like we talk a lot about God's power. Like we emphasize that a lot. You see that in a lot of like worship songs. You see that pastors preaching. It's like, you have power because of Jesus in you. You have power because of the Holy Spirit in you. And so I think if God does that, like, who are we not to? Like, as people who love him and as people who want to be like Jesus. And so I think there's that from like perhaps the biggest reason. But I think even just as Christians, as people who want to be in relationship with others, you have to understand them. You can't, I think, to have true authentic relationship, you have to understand where one another is coming from. You have to understand the context in which they live so that you can have conversations and actually understand one another, because one thing may mean something completely different.
Totally.
Yeah. And so I think there's that, especially with us becoming a more globalized society. I think especially when it comes to missions, I think a lot of the things that we've messed up in as Christians in the past maybe came from a lack of contextualization.
Totally.
Of like, hey, church looks like this in the West, so it looks like this here. Where perhaps there's a lot more nuance to that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of interwoven into so many things, into everyday relationship, into mission work, into even just how the Lord shows himself to us. And I think once we understand that, like, God contextualizes himself, one thing that I've noticed, and I love saying this, you've probably heard me say this a few times, but I think different cultures see God in different ways. And the more we interact with different cultures and the more we're willing to see things from their perspective, the more we see God in ways we've never seen him before. And I think that should be like the perfect driver in itself for us to want to learn about different contexts.
I'm speechless.
What do you like? What would you say is like your reason of why you think this matters?
I don't have anything to add. What you shared, I really don't. I think it's important to understand where people are coming from, because our worldview has like even ingrained in it, like this notion of perspective. And if you're seeing something from a certain perspective, if somebody else is seeing it from a different perspective, I think the tendency is to be like, especially if you're a Westerner, like, well, that's wrong, like my perspective is right.
Yeah.
And sometimes things might be wrong, but I think more likely things might just be different. And so I remember getting really frustrated when, as a teenager, I moved to Asia and in an honor shame society, and I didn't have language for this, but I remember just feeling really convicted about like words matter and integrity matters, and we're supposed to let our yes be yes and our no be yes, or no be no. And when people would answer no with maybe, I'm like, come on, what the heck, man? Like, just tell me no. And I thought that was a lack of honesty, but I don't think Jesus sees it that way. I think it's more like, okay, that person was actually trying to honor me by not giving me a flat out no. But that was just like an example of cultural clashing.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think it's important to understand just to love people well, like you were saying, everyday life, mission, like the whole litany of reasons. And I think the gospel sounds different in different places. And so if I, like in Western context, right, it's largely Jesus died, and so that we can be free from, like, it's a very courtroom-esque type of scene of like, we were declared guilty, but God took the punishment for us, like very punitive, so that we can have his righteousness. And I think largely that aspiration to be righteous is what we long for, which is maybe even the impetus behind some of this anxiety, is like, whether we know Jesus or not, I think there is a longing to be righteous, whether that is like, do I post the right thing on social media, or which kind of trickles into honor shame, but that's a different caveat. But we long to be, right, to be righteous in God's eyes and our eyes, like you said. If you're in a fear power context, it is victory, and the gospel does speak to that. Like, Jesus is the victorious one, and we get to enter into his victory. I think in a more honor shame context, it's like, hallelujah, like we have a family, we have a place that we get to belong. Like this anxiety about like, am I good enough? Am I worthy enough? Like, will someone accept me? I can never measure up to this unattainable mark. But praise God, like Jesus, I never could. And Jesus doesn't need me to. He's reached the mark. And I get to enter into his honor, honestly. And so, I think the gospel does sound differently. And you mentioned that we're becoming an increasingly globalized society. My hope is that we stay that direction and don't go further into like nationalism, but another tangent. I agree. Hallelujah. But I think with that, at least the America that I grew up in when I was little is different than the American now. And I think there is more fear power dynamics. And I think there is more honor shame dynamics.
Absolutely.
And so I think, especially as people who are like ministers of the gospel, but honestly, just like, if we're in Jesus, we are to be like ambassadors of Christ, right? And so as ambassadors, I think we have to develop a little bit of a fluency in the gospel in different places, not just for ourselves, our friendships, our families, whatnot, but how do we minister to somebody who's stuck in like a specific part of this? So
absolutely,
that was a whole rant for somebody who said they didn't have anything to say.
No, I think like that was beautifully said. Especially, I love how you pointed out that like the Bible, like the story of Jesus sounds differently. And we actually did an exercise like that. Dr. Kim, shout out Dr. Kim, where she like had us basically like do a little evangelizing skit of like, how do you evangelize to somebody in like different contexts? And I think especially like you pointed out, like, especially now, I think that's something that I don't think I've heard many conversations. And whenever it comes to like evangelisms and like tools and stuff, I think a lot of it in America, which perhaps maybe outdated. Say that carefully, because I think there's still obviously a lot of American context around, so not fully outdated. But I think maybe when it comes to evangelism, that's a conversation that needs to be had too. Of like, hey, obviously it's great that you're talking about salvation in the sense of like the courtroom, but what if you're talking to somebody from a different context? Maybe
or
that
generation too.
Yeah, exactly, from generation as well. Like maybe that doesn't have as much impact as you like asking them what like questions to figure out what context they're in and then framing it in that way, in a way that they can maybe see God in a way that's a bit more contextualized to their life and to their like experience. So it's just a thought that came to my mind of like, I don't think I've seen that as much.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more that I could ask, and I will, but yeah, I just want to thank you, Keren. This has been really insightful. I always love chatting with you. Do you have any like final thoughts?
Not really. Just go learn about contextualization, man. It's my favorite word.
Booyah. Peace out, y'all.
Yeah. See ya.
Hey family, thank you for listening today. We're so glad you're here, and we hope as always that your time spent with us turns out to be a blessing in your walk with the Lord and your love for your neighbor. If you'd like to support this podcast, there are 3 ways you can do that. First, your prayers. Please be praying for us. We want to talk about the scriptures in a way that is encouraging and edifying to the body, as well as is helpful to people in unpacking some of these nuanced topics. Second of all, as a new podcast, it really helps if you leave a comment or interact with us on social media. And third, if you'd like to financially support this podcast, contribute towards things like our editing software, there's a way that you can do that through our link in the bio. Peace out, y'all. See you next time.